I tried to protect her.
Okay.
And I should have stayed, but I panicked. Him took the brunt of it.
Yeah.
I tried to stop him. I went around from behind. I didn't have the strength to stop him. I'm sorry, Kim. I love you. How's Kim? Please tell me. Why won't you tell me, please?
22-year-old Amarion Daniels was sitting in a car in Columbus, Ohio in December of 2024 when a knife-wielding man opened the door and stabbed him to death. At the time of the deadly attack, Daniels was hanging out with 21-year-old Courtney Webb. He had been killed by Webb's boyfriend, 23-year-old Shavar Johnson. Webb told police that Daniels had tried to rob her at gunpoint and that Johnson had stepped in to protect her, but the story did not align with surveillance footage of the incident, which appeared to show Johnson ambushing Daniels in an unprovoked fashion. Upon being confronted with the video evidence, Webb reportedly changed her story and then asked for a lawyer. A search of the suspect's phones turned up even more incriminating evidence, including text messages containing stated plans to kill Daniels for supposedly stealing money and marijuana from Webb. Prosecutors described the stabbing as entirely staged and are pursuing multiple counts of murder against both Webb and Johnson, who remain in custody with bonds set in the 7-figure range. Number 18. Haley Potter. While working as an anchor for the Pennsylvania-based Erie News Now in April of 2022, 22-year-old Haley Potter told state police that someone had been stalking her for over a month. She claimed that she had received unwanted calls and voicemails, flowers at her workplace, and a handwritten note that had been slipped into her Harbor Creek Township home through the crack beneath her front door. In her complaint, Potter noted that the stalker seemed constantly aware of her whereabouts. She also accused the unnamed individual of hacking into her social media accounts, sending explicit messages to her boyfriend, and fraudulently making hundreds of dollars worth of purchases using her debit card information. During a 3-month investigation, police traced the alleged hack into Potter's cell phone, leading to the suspicion that she had made the entire stalking story up. She reportedly admitted to being responsible for all the messages and fraudulent activity that she had reported, and was accused of trying to pin the phony crimes on a 26-year-old male victim. Potter was charged with a slew of crimes, including forgery, false swearing to mislead a public servant, identity theft, device access fraud, theft by taking, false reports to law enforcement, and more. In September 2023, she pleaded guilty of 1 count each of theft by unlawful taking, identity theft, and false reports. She was sentenced to 2 years of probation and, perhaps not surprisingly, no longer works for Erie News Now. Number 17. Sara McKenzie. After her 13-year relationship with Trevor Dibner ended, British retiree Sara McKenzie tried to rekindle the flame, but Dibner wasn't interested, and McKenzie was furious when she discovered that her ex was engaged to his new girlfriend, 59-year-old Joy Bolton. Unable to contain her jealous rage, 62-year-old McKenzie went to Bolton's home in Ash, Surrey, in May of 2023 and bludgeoned her to death. She then disposed of her clothing and the murder weapon, thinking her knowledge as an armchair true crime expert would be enough to prevent her from getting caught, took a bath and resumed her normal routine as if nothing had happened. But she wasn't as slick as she seemed to think, because she apparently didn't realize that her DNA would be found beneath Bolton's fingernails after the victim had scratched her in the face. McKenzie was also found lurking near the murder scene, which only furthered any existing suspicions regarding her involvement in the crime. In a last-ditch effort to spare herself from a potential lifetime behind bars, McKenzie told police a far-fetched pack of lies about how her DNA could have innocently gotten beneath Bolton's fingernails. She was found guilty of murder in 2023 and is serving a 26-year sentence, which at her age means that there's a good chance she'll die in prison. Number 16. Michael White. 29-year-old Liana White was 4 months pregnant when her SUV was found abandoned in an Edmonton, Alberta parking lot in July of 2005. Her shoes were on the pavement right outside the open driver's side door, along with a trail of her belongings leading away from the vehicle. Police visited Liana's home, where they found no signs of foul play, and called her husband, Michael, who was working at a local garage as a mechanic. Michael told investigators that Liana had woken up and left for her hospital job as usual that morning. When asked about whether Liana might want to abandon her life and start anew, Michael claimed that their marriage was good despite money being tight. Friends and family hadn't noticed any red flags about the couple's relationship, and they described Liana as a cautious and stable person who would never abandon her and Michael's young daughter. A closer look at her abandoned SUV and its surroundings led to the suspicion that someone had staged the scene to make it look like an abduction had taken place. It was also evident that someone much taller than Liana had been driving the SUV, causing investigators to turn their attention toward Michael, who was 6'3". Within days of her disappearance, Liana White's heavily decomposed body was found in a ditch. She had been stabbed to death, and Michael remained the top suspect in the case. A man matching Michael's description had been captured on video near the crime scene on the morning Liana vanished, and Michael was suspiciously composed and emotionless in his interactions with law enforcement and the media. His alibi was discredited by eyewitness accounts that conflicted with his story about when Liana left the house, and police found evidence of blood and a cleanup effort at the couple's home. Michael maintained his innocence, but was ultimately convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to at least 17 years behind bars. In 2020, he was granted day leave from prison, even though he actively denied killing Liana during his parole hearing, claiming that he behaved suspiciously because the stress of the situation had caused him not to think clearly. Additionally, Michael was assessed to be at low risk of recidivism but a high risk of domestic violence, and was barred from seeing his girlfriend. He nevertheless went on to be granted full parole in 2023 and is now a free man. Number 15. Tausha Morton. By the time she was 30 years old, Tausha Morton had been married 5 times. Her 4th marriage had ended in 2003 when her husband at the time, 39-year-old Mitch Kemp, packed up their child and moved out of the couple's Columbia, Missouri home. Just months later, Morton met and married husband number 5, 40-year-old Greg Morton. At some point in 2004, Kemp vanished without a trace. He had several warrants out for his arrest at the time, so his family initially wondered if he was simply laying low while evading law enforcement. But as time passed, they grew increasingly concerned about Kemp, eventually prompting them to report him missing. Kemp had last been seen about 6 months earlier at a rural property where Tausha and Greg lived. The Mortons claimed to have no knowledge of Kemp's disappearance, and his whereabouts remained a mystery for years to come. Tausha and Greg eventually divorced, and in 2007, Tausha moved in with her new boyfriend, Dwayne Barrentine, at his Marianna, Florida home. Several months into the relationship, Barrentine and his family began to suspect that Tausha was a cheater and a pathological liar. He snooped into her MySpace account and was shocked to discover evidence that she may have been involved in Kemp's disappearance and murder. One of Tausha's exes told Barrentine that Tausha had drunkenly confessed to having ex-husband number 5, Greg Morton, kill Kemp. It was enough for Barrentine to call the authorities, sparking a renewed investigation into Kemp's case. Investigators questioned Tausha, who initially maintained her innocence but eventually admitted that Greg had killed Kemp. Tausha claimed that she had only kept silent about Kemp's murder out of a fear for her life. She led law enforcement to Kemp's body, and Greg also cooperated. Greg testified against Tausha at trial, claiming she wanted Kemp dead so she would have sole custody of their daughter. In exchange for his testimony, Greg received a 19-year sentence for second-degree murder, and in 2010 Tausha was found guilty and sentenced to life without parole. Number 14. Jesse McDonald. In March of 2018, 25-year-old Jesse McDonald connected with a 36-year-old transgender woman named Naomi Hersey through a dating website. They made arrangements to meet, hook up, and use drugs at the hotel where McDonald was living near Britain's Heathrow Airport. After spending 3 days together, McDonald stabbed Hersey to death in his hotel room. He then called his girlfriend, 18-year-old Natalia Darkowska, for help cleaning up the crime scene and disposing of Hersey's body. McDonald denied cheating on Darkowska, instead claiming that the victim was a drug dealer who had tied him up and assaulted him for days. He also called his mother and said that he had stabbed Hersey to death in fear for his life, believing she was going to smother him with a pillow. McDonald's mother called the police, but by the time officers arrived at the hotel, McDonald and Darkowska had fled. They were tracked down at a nearby hotel and taken in for questioning. Throughout his interview with detectives and his subsequent court proceedings, McDonald continuously insisted that he had been drugged and assaulted, but the evidence overwhelmingly indicated that the interactions between McDonald and Hersey were consensual. Further investigation revealed that McDonald had offered the hotel owner a designer watch and asked him to clean up the crime scene. In October of 2018, McDonald was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life with a minimum of 20 years. His motive for killing Hersey remains unclear to this day, since he has never admitted to the crime. Number 13. Mitesh Patel. In what initially appeared to be the tragic result of a robbery gone wrong. 34-year-old Jessica Patel was strangled to death at her home in Linthorpe, England in May of 2018. Her family found her lifeless body bound with duct tape and surrounded by her ransacked belongings. Jessica's husband, Mitesh Patel, seemed genuinely devastated by his wife's murder, but a police investigation quickly identified him as the prime suspect in the case, leaving the slain woman's family shocked. Mitesh had meticulously planned the homicide over a 5-year period as part of a plan to obtain Jessica's fertilized embryos and move to Sydney, where he had a secret boyfriend. He had only married Jessica to keep his conservative Hindu parents at bay and had been hooking up with men behind his wife's back throughout the marriage. Meanwhile, he was neglecting and mistreating Jessica, who told her family that Mitesh had suddenly lost interest in her after their wedding. At one point, Mitesh even had one of his lovers come to stay with him and Jessica during a visit to England and had introduced the man to his wife as a friend, but his plan to live happily ever after in Australia never came to fruition due to his decision to kill Jessica, and he is now serving a minimum of 30 years behind bars for her murder. Number 12. Greg Wilson. 41-year-old Colleen Greenwood of County Durham, England, was enamoured when she met her firefighter and single father named James Scott through a dating website in 2014. In addition to being a hero who saved lives, he was a hopeless romantic who pulled out all the stops to win Greenwood's heart. It worked, and the relationship continued for the next 2 years, during which time the couple had a baby. Scott had previously claimed that he had gotten a vasectomy, so the pregnancy came as a complete shock to Greenwood. She was happy about it, but this marked the first of many major lies that Scott was eventually caught in. Greenwood accepted Scott's marriage proposal only to later learn that he was married and had abandoned his wife and 3 kids, leaving his spouse broke and struggling to make ends meet. His real name was Greg Wilson, and he had never worked as a firefighter but was jobless and lived with his parents. Wilson had also swindled money out of Greenwood's sister, who by then had grown to consider him a member of the family. Using forged financial documents, he had persuaded the sister to loan him startup money for a business that he apparently never planned to actually open. He was also a serial dine and dasher and cancelled his wedding to Greenwood twice, leading her family to suspect that he was keeping secrets. Greenwood's relatives discovered that Wilson had never booked the wedding venue, despite having invitations made. Before they could confront him, he vanished, leaving Greenwood to raise their son on her own. The authorities eventually caught up with Wilson, and in 2020 he was sentenced to 6 years in prison for multiple counts of fraud. His reasons for living as a con man are unclear, especially because most of the money he obtained through his lies went toward funding the ruse, rather than into his pocket. Number 11. Anisah Ahmed. In what was later dubbed a real-life Fatal Attraction scenario, 37-year-old Anisah Ahmed was shocked to discover that her lover of 9 months, barrister Iqbal Muhammad, was married. The two had met in 2014 after Ahmed, who claimed to be a lawyer, had reached out to Muhammad for career advice. In addition to telling Muhammad's wife about the affair, Ahmed embarked on a relentless campaign of torment against his former paramour. She set up email accounts in Muhammad's name and tried to frame him for assault, kidnapping, and other crimes. As Muhammad used his expertise as an attorney to fight for his innocence against a mounting pile of false allegations, Ahmed recruited her ex-boyfriend to help her in a last-ditch effort to nail her former fling with a crime he didn't commit. She asked her ex to stab her so she could blame Muhammad for it, but he refused, so she did it herself. Ahmed then called the police and claimed that she had just escaped from hitmen who had been hired by Muhammad to kill her, but her lies were ultimately exposed in court, and in 2021, Ahmed became Britain's first criminal defendant to receive a life sentence for perverting the course of justice. She was required to serve at least 4.5 years in prison, but in a surprising turn of events, an appeals court overturned Ahmed's sentence. She was resentenced to a decade behind bars, but was released on home confinement in November of 2014. During Ahmed's revenge campaign, Muhammad lived in constant fear, leaving him so traumatized that he was no longer able to watch the movie Fatal Attraction. Now that Ahmed has been released from prison, Muhammad is once again living in a state of heightened stress and anxiety, especially since he learned about her release from news reporters rather than the police, who apparently didn't bother to notify him. Number 10. Ashley Gaddie. On the night of December 17, 2022, 35-year-old Ashley Gaddie beat 31-year-old Danielle Finlay Jones to death at a home in the Sydney suburb of Cranebrook. He then ventured into the Blue Mountains, where he engaged in a 12-hour standoff with law enforcement before finally being captured. Gaddie and Finlay Jones had met at a pub for drinks after connecting on the Bumble app. Later that evening, they retired to the home of one of Finlay Jones's friends, who discovered her body the next day. Finlay Jones had been mindful to meet with Gaddie in public and then take him to the home of a trusted friend. She was unaware that Gaddie had a history of violence against women, which included a previous attempt on the life of his ex-girlfriend, Rachel Pykar. 5 women had obtained restraining orders against Gaddie in recent years, including Pykar, who later described Gaddie as deceptively charming. Pykar had received a random Facebook request from Gaddie, and at first he seemed like the perfect boyfriend, but it was a ruse, according to Pykar, who later told the Daily Mail that Gaddie targeted single mothers and wore them down with sudden outbursts of rage and abuse. Given Gaddie's history, members of the public were outraged that he had been granted bail in his previous cases, enabling him to walk free and giving him a chance to kill Finlay Jones. He was held without bail following the murder, but was found dead in his prison cell 16 months later, bringing the unresolved case to an abrupt and unexpected end. Number 9. Andre Rebelo. When 58-year-old Colleen Rebelo was found dead in her Perth, Australia home in May of 2020, investigators didn't initially suspect foul play. An autopsy failed to reveal a definitive cause of death, leading to the suspicion that Colleen had succumbed to natural, albeit mysterious means. Authorities began to rethink Colleen's possible cause and manner of death after her son, Andre Zachary Rebelo, tried to cash in on life insurance policies totaling $500,000 that he had taken out in his mother's name just days before her untimely demise. The insurance company alerted police to the suspicious nature of the claim, and an investigation was launched in November 2022. More than 2 years after Colleen's death, authorities arrested 26-year-old Andre for murder, by which point he was already facing a litany of fraud charges. On the surface, Andre appeared to be a successful cryptocurrency investor. He also managed the social media accounts of his influencer girlfriend, Gracie Piscopo, who has more than 1 million followers, but his luxurious lifestyle came at a cost that he couldn't keep up with on his earnings alone, leaving him saddled with debt and his credit line stretched to its limit. By the time Andre fell under suspicion for his mother's murder, her body had been cremated against her wishes, thanks to a forged last will and testament that Andre had furnished shortly after Colleen's death. He was also accused of forging medical documents, Colleen's death certificate, and a phony investigation record. Prosecutors argued that Andre committed these crimes in a desperate attempt to continue his upscale lifestyle and avoid losing Piscopo. Following Andre's arrest, Piscopo wisely wiped any trace of him from her social media. She was ultimately cleared of any wrongdoing after investigators established that she was unaware of Andre's crimes, which had left her in significant debt due to his mismanagement of their finances. Following an 8-week trial in late 2024, a jury found Rebelo guilty of Colleen's murder. He had maintained his innocence throughout the case and was supported by his father, who described the verdict as disappointing. Andre remains in custody as he awaits sentencing, which is scheduled for April 2025. Number 8. Cindy Schulz-Juedes. In 2004, single father of 4 and career pharmacist Ken Juedes eloped with a woman named Cindy Schulz and moved her into his beautiful farmhouse in Warsaw, Wisconsin. The marriage ended abruptly just 2 years later when Cindy called 911 and reported finding Ken dead in a pool of blood on their bed. Ken had been fatally shot. Next to him on Cindy's side of the bed was a piece of paper with the B word handwritten on it, affixed to Cindy's pillow with a knife. Cindy told police that she had slept in the couple's camper the night before to escape the noise of their household. She claimed she was heavily medicated and therefore did not hear the 2 gunshots that killed Ken or their barking dog, leaving her unaware that anything was wrong until she woke up that morning and went inside. Within days of Ken's death, Cindy stopped taking calls from his family members and removed photos of his children from the walls of the couple's home. She also went against his Catholic mother's wishes and had Ken's body cremated. Ken's kids were shocked to learn that their father had supposedly written them out of his will, leaving his entire estate to Cindy, who was also the sole beneficiary of his life insurance policy. They suspected that Cindy was involved in their father's murder, while Cindy accused Ken's children of conspiring with one another to kill their dad. She also pointed the finger at Ken's business partner, whom he had had a falling out with, the troubled teens that the couple had taken in as foster children, and some local drunks. But these persons of interest were ultimately cleared and the investigation circled back to Cindy. Lacking a smoking gun, prosecutors decided to try the case based on circumstantial evidence. In 2021, due to fears that aging witnesses would pass away if they waited much longer, Cindy was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison, but was beaten to death by her cellmate just a year later in July of 2023. 27-year-old Taylor Sanchez is facing a first-degree murder charge in connection with Cindy's death after claiming that voices had told her to kill the 67-year-old. Number 7. Jonathan Houseman. In late September of 2020, 31-year-old Will Henry and his best friend and business partner, 29-year-old Brian McIntosh, were found dead from multiple gunshot wounds inside a Range Rover in the English town of Brierley Hill. Investigators traced the crime to 33-year-old Jonathan Houseman, who was seen on surveillance footage exiting the Range Rover after the double shooting. Houseman was accused of conspiring with 33-year-old Richard Avery to kill the victims, who had recently grown frustrated with Houseman over an estimated $500,000 in back pay that he owed to the men for work that they had completed. McIntosh and Henry wanted their money, but Houseman had repeatedly failed to make payments as promised. Following his arrest, Houseman claimed that the men had been murdered by an unnamed gunman, but there was no evidence to suggest that anyone else was present when the crime occurred, and Houseman was charged with the murders. Prosecutors accused Houseman of meticulously planning the murders out of pure greed while facing a mountain of debt. Avery claimed that he had only helped Houseman out of a fear for his life after someone had threatened him. He was cleared of murder but found guilty of perverting the course of justice. In August 2021, Houseman was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life with a minimum of 40 years. Number 6. Michael Jones. 26-year-old Diana Douve vanished in Vero Beach, Florida during a night out in June of 2014 after leaving her friends to meet up with her on and off boyfriend, 32-year-old Mike Jones. She was last seen leaving a bar with Jones at 1:30 in the morning. The next day, Jones called out of work claiming that he was sick and would be gone for a few days. He then withdrew $2,500 from the bank, bought a burner phone at Walmart, and booked a room at a hotel where he told staff not to tell anyone that he was staying there. Unbeknownst to Douve's friends and family, Jones had a prior conviction for stalking his ex-girlfriend. Police tracked him down at the hotel and arrested him for violating his probation, which prohibited him from leaving the Vero Beach area. In the meantime, detectives traced one of Jones's cell phone pings to a Publix parking lot in Melbourne, where they found Douve's murdered body in the trunk of her car. Jones pleaded not guilty to first-degree murder, and the case finally went to trial in 2019, more than 5 years after Douve was killed. Prosecutors accused Jones of beating and strangling Douve at his apartment, where Douve's body had been found in the garage. The jury found Jones guilty as charged, but failed to reach a unanimous decision in favor of the death penalty, resulting in a life sentence without parole. Number 5. Alisa Knight. 63-year-old bus driver Peter Knight thought he had found the love of his life in 43-year-old mother of 5, Lisa Jane Davis, who he believed was a successful doctor working in critical care at a hospital in Dundonald, Scotland. Shortly before the couple's planned wedding in 2023, Knight received troubling text messages from the family of Davis's 5th husband, warning him about her shady past. Blinded by love, Knight went through with the wedding only to later discover that Davis was a convicted bigamist who had been tricking men into marriages for years. Just days after their wedding, she had traveled to Bali and participated in a commitment ceremony with another man, while claiming to be at a medical conference. Davis was also lying about being a doctor and tragically losing a daughter who was alive and well. Knight reported Davis to the authorities, who are reportedly investigating the woman's confusing and complicated lifestyle to determine if she has committed any new crimes. In the meantime, Knight has made the wise decision to move on with his life as he grapples with residual feelings of heartbreak and betrayal. Number 4. Andrew Cobby. In November of 2017, 51-year-old mother of 3, Kim Cobby, was found dead by her brother-in-law in the driveway of her Gold Coast, Australia home. She had been bludgeoned with a claw hammer and strangled to death while taking out her garbage. Suspicion quickly fell on Kim's estranged husband, Andrew John Cobby, who was apprehended near the murder scene. Andrew acted devastated by Kim's murder and claimed that unnamed individuals had tried extorting millions from the couple shortly before his wife's death.
We've been receiving threats. Someone's trying to extort millions of dollars out of us.
He was equally cryptic about Kim's death, blaming her murder on a mystery assailant who had supposedly been seen lurking on Kim's property shortly before the deadly attack. In what seemed like a telltale to investigators, Andrew claimed that he had tried saving Kim but was overpowered by the attacker.
I tried to protect her.
Okay.
And I should have stayed, but I panicked. Kim took the brunt of it.
Yeah.
I tried to stop him. I went around from behind. I didn't have the strength to stop him. I'm sorry, Kim. I love you. How's Kim? Please tell me. Why won't you tell me, please?
He told police that he fled the scene in fear for his life and tripped on some rocks, causing him to fall, but his story didn't add up with the evidence, and he was charged with Kim's murder. A closer look at Andrew and Kim's relationship revealed that Andrew had scammed 10 investors out of a collective $170,000 in recent years. He had guaranteed his victims attractive, risk-free returns on their investments, but fell out of touch without paying any of the money. Frustrated by Andrew's broken promises, the investors contacted Kim and told her about her husband's scam. Kim arranged a meeting with Andrew and his victims, which was captured in an audio recording by one of the attendees. In the recording, the investors could be heard demanding to see proof that the money existed and accusing Andrew of using their funds to solve his personal problems. Andrew tried convincing his victims that their money was safe, claiming that he had a government insider who was risking their job to ensure that everyone would get what was owed to them. No one at the meeting seemed angry at Kim, and the recording was presented in court during Andrew's trial as evidence that none of the scam victims had killed his wife. In November 2021, Andrew was found guilty of Kim's murder and jailed for life. Now in his early 60s, he's in the process of appealing his case while fighting fraud charges. Number 3. Roshawn Bishop. On a summer day in 2017, a pair of gunmen wreaked havoc on a gender reveal party just outside Cincinnati in Coleraine Township, Ohio. A 22-year-old guest, Autumn Garrett, was fatally shot in the hail of bullets while 8 other guests and a dog were injured. Investigators spent the next year and a half pursuing mostly fruitless leads and trying to get uncooperative witnesses to talk. They learned that the guest of honor at the party, 21-year-old Cheyenne Willis, had been faking her pregnancy. She was also having an extramarital affair with one of the suspects, 28-year-old Roshawn Bishop. Autumn Garrett, Willis's cousin, had no involvement with the suspects and just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. In late 2018, Bishop, 23-year-old James Eccles, and 21-year-old Michael Sannon were each indicted on 22 charges in connection with the shooting. A fourth suspect, Vandal Slade, was also eventually arrested for his role in the crime. Bishop had masterminded the crime but was the most cooperative with authorities out of all the suspects. He admitted that he had paid Eccles and Sannon $1,500 to kill Willis to avoid paying back a $10,000 loan she had given him for a car. Eccles was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to 41 years, while Sannon received an 11-year prison sentence for attempted murder. Bishop pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter and attempted murder in 2023 and is serving a 10-year term, while Slade pleaded guilty to complicity to commit involuntary manslaughter. He was sentenced to 12 years with credit for time served, amounting to roughly 8 more years in prison. Today's topic was requested by Forte Pacino. If you have any other topics you'd like to learn about, subscribe and let us know in the comments section below. Number 2. Elisabeth Finch. Elisabeth Finch was a highly praised television writer who was best known for her work on the True Blood and Grey's Anatomy series, but she derailed from her successful path in 2022 when she fell under suspicion for faking a years-long battle with cancer. Finch's employer had been tipped off about Finch's deception from her wife, Jennifer Bayer, who works as a nurse. Thanks to her trained eye, Bayer had noticed some inconsistencies in Finch's claims about her medical conditions, and some additional digging quickly confirmed Bayer's suspicions about her wife's dishonesty. She gave Finch a chance to come clean to everyone in their lives, but Finch had remained reluctant, prompting Bayer to make good on her word to make sure the truth was known. Finch was placed on leave while her employer carried out an internal investigation. She refused to provide documentation or undergo a medical exam in order to prove that she was really sick, and instead quit her job. Realizing that the ruse was up, Finch admitted that she had lied about her cancer diagnosis and numerous other things, including getting an abortion, losing a friend in the 2018 Pittsburgh synagogue shooting, and the tragic death of her brother, who was alive and well. She has kept an extremely low profile ever since, and it's unclear what she's up to these days. but Finch is no longer welcome among the same circles she used to run in and is divorced from Bayer, who shared her side of the story in the 2024 Peacock series, Anatomy of a Lie. If you have not yet seen our release about when setting people up goes wrong, then be sure to hang back after number 1, because that's lined up right after. Number 1. Mick Carling. 61-year-old Mick Carling was a familiar sight at military commemoration events in and around the English town of Malton, where he was known to show up in full regalia with a plethora of medals attached. He claimed he had served in elite regiments in the Falklands War and Afghanistan over a 20-year period, but his story unraveled in November 2024 when he fell under the scrutiny of a suspicious group of veterans. The group found no records of Carling serving in the capacity that he had claimed or being awarded any of the medals he showed off. Additionally, the parachute regiment that Carling claimed he served in didn't even exist until 2 years after he supposedly retired. When confronted by the media, Carling admitted that he had exaggerated his service record but avoided discussing his deception at length, simply stating that he had overstated his experience and had lied about just some medals. That's all. He suffered from some arguably deserved public embarrassment but does not appear to be facing criminal charges. 25-year-old English woman Caprice Buddle invited a man she'd been flirting with to a house in Waterlooville, Hampshire on May the 5th of 2019. The man had been chatting with Buddle on a consistent basis and even met her in person several times before the day in question. However, upon their arrival at the property, the victim, who was in his 30s at the time, was robbed, tortured and assaulted by 37-year-old Sean Perry. Over the course of multiple hours, official reports on the matter described how the unnamed victim was hit over the head with a stool, kicked and forced to consume cleaning fluid before having his phone, wallet and bank card stolen. Perry then blindfolded the man and drove him around for an undisclosed period of time, after which he was dumped by the side of the road. The victim subsequently ran home and contacted the police, who located Buddle at a house in Havant that same day and took her into custody on charges of conspiracy to rob, false imprisonment, conspiracy to commit fraud, and possession of a Class A drug. Following a trial at Portsmouth Crown Court, Buddle was found guilty of the offences levied against her and was consequently jailed for 10 years. Perry, meanwhile, was arrested several days after the incident. He ultimately pleaded guilty to a plethora of charges, which resulted in him receiving a prison sentence of 17 years. Number 14. The crimes of Khalil Wheeler Weaver. 20-year-old college student Sarah Butler was back home in Montclair, New Jersey over Thanksgiving break 2016 when she suddenly went missing. Some of Butler's friends subsequently logged into her social media accounts and discovered she'd been communicating with an Orange resident by the name of Khalil Wheeler Weaver leading up to her disappearance. In a bid to catch the man they suspected of kidnapping the young student, Butler's friends and relatives set up a fake social media profile to attract Wheeler Weaver's attention online. They then arranged for an intimate rendezvous with the man using the fictitious character they created. When he showed up for the meeting, however, he was detained by Montclair police on suspicion of being involved in Butler's disappearance. The young woman's remains were ultimately found hidden beneath tree branches in Eagle Rock Reservation. It was determined that she'd been fatally strangled with her own sweatpants, and the individual responsible for the murder was identified as Wheeler Weaver. In the aftermath of his arrest, it emerged that the man, who was in his early 20s at the time, had lured at least 2 other women into deadly traps in the months leading up to Butler's slaying. Back in August of 2016, 19-year-old Robin West was spotted getting into a car with Wheeler Weaver. Within the next few hours, she was fatally strangled, and her body was later found in an abandoned house in West Orange that had been set on fire. About a month later, the remains of Newark woman Joanne Brown were found in another abandoned house. She too had been strangled to death by Wheeler Weaver, according to subsequent reports. One of the women he'd targeted, later identified as Tiffany Taylor, woke up in the midst of his attack and managed to escape with her life. In 2019, despite maintaining his innocence, the man was found guilty of 3 counts of murder and desecration of human remains, 2 counts of aggravated assault, attempted murder, aggravated arson, and kidnapping. He was consequently sentenced to 160 years behind bars. In March of 2022, Wheeler Weaver faced criminal charges in connection to a fourth killing, that of Marwa Daumbia. The latter's remains were found in May of 2019, but weren't positively identified for more than 2 years thereafter. Number 13. Jared Lovison. Australian man Jared Lovison vanished without trace on April the 16th of 2020 after telling a friend that he was going to meet a girl with whom he hoped to have intimate relations. His whereabouts remained unknown until 5 weeks later when his body was found in bushland in the Moondara State Park in Victoria's Gippsland region. Court records revealed that in the weeks following 37-year-old Lovison's disappearance, the police had uncovered a nefarious plot involving a friend of the man's named Samantha Guilherme. The latter allegedly took advantage of the victim's reported desire for intimacy with her to lure him to the remote area where a pair of co-conspirators planned to teach him a lesson. Guilherme's co-accused were identified as her boyfriend, 28-year-old Jake Brown, and 49-year-old Andrew Price, who'd reportedly been feuding with Lovison over his relationship with a woman whom the victim had previously dated. In the early morning hours of April the 16th, Lovison rode his bike to the area where he believed he was meeting up with Guilherme. However, as the pair was sitting in a car smoking cigarettes, Brown and Price ambushed an unsuspecting Lovison with firearms and led him into the nearby bush where they forced him to consume a lethal dose of the depressant GHB. In the wake of her subsequent arrest, Guilherme claimed to have been under the impression that Brown and Price simply planned to beat Lovison up rather than kill him. In December of 2022, however, she pleaded guilty to manslaughter and was scheduled to be sentenced in February of the following year. Brown and Price, on the other hand, each faced murder charges in connection to Lovison's death. They both entered pleas of not guilty and were scheduled to stand trial in May of 2023. Number 12. Zayed E. I'm going out now. I want to kill my first one. I'm excited. Wish me luck that it works. That was the alarming text message received by friends of an 18-year-old German woman identified only as Sara M. in May of 2021. 5 days earlier, the young woman had reportedly purchased a knife that measured roughly 5 inches in length. She had set up an online dating profile under the fake name Domina Cherry, which she'd used to arrange a meeting with a man named only as Zayed E., who was 39 at the time, on the day of their date. The same day Sara sent her chilling text to her friends, Zayed picked her up from her home in Bavaria. As the pair were driving along, she allegedly produced the blade she'd recently bought and plunged it into the man's neck. A physical struggle ensued, culminating in Zayed wresting the weapon away from his date and stopping the vehicle. Due to his severe wounds, he eventually fell into a coma and passed away at the hospital 3 weeks later. Less than an hour after the initial altercation, Sara was taken into police custody in the town of Ebermannstadt. In the wake of the incident, investigators learned that the suspect idolized infamous serial killers such as Ted Bundy and Richard Ramirez, both of whom were featured in pin-up posters on the young woman's bedroom wall. Sara had lured Zayed on a date that night for the expressed purpose of killing him, seeking to emulate the mass murderers she revered. In court, the judge admonished her for her lack of remorse, noting, "It is extremely rare for a perpetrator to kill a person out of lust for murder." The defense team emphasized Sara's age as well as her history of drug abuse in an attempt to mitigate her punishment. In the end, she was sentenced to 12 years in a socio-therapeutic facility. As her sentence was being announced, Sara held up her hand to reveal a pentagram mirroring the actions of Richard Ramirez during his 1988 murder trial. Number 11. Ollie Stevens. An English schoolboy named Ollie Stevens agreed to meet up with a girl at Bugs Bottom, a field near his home in Reading, Berkshire, shortly before 5 p.m. on January the 3rd of 2021. Upon arrival, however, Stevens was ambushed by a pair of teen boys who proceeded to launch a physical attack on him. At some point during the altercation, one of the assailants produced a knife, which he used to stab the victim twice. The two boys subsequently fled the scene, along with the unnamed girl whom it would later emerge they'd tasked with luring Stevens to the field in order for them to harm him. An off-duty nurse who happened to be walking her dog near Bugs Bottom witnessed the stabbing and subsequently rendered aid to the wounded teen until the arrival of emergency crews. Paramedics performed CPR on Stevens for half an hour, but he ultimately died while being transported to the hospital. About 2 hours later, one of the boys responsible for the fatal attack admitted his involvement in a text to another teenager, writing, "It was me and my boy. I started slapping him up, and then my boy backed out and then shanked him." The other suspect called the stabbing the biggest mistake of my life in another text, claiming it was done out of pure anger. Investigators subsequently learned that the assailants had targeted Stevens in connection to a previous disagreement. The victim had reportedly seen a Snapchat video in which the two teens in question had humiliated a younger boy. Stevens tried alerting the young boy's brother, which angered his attackers and set into motion the events that ultimately led to their deadly confrontation at Bugs Bottom. Less than a week after the attack, the suspects were identified and arrested by Thames Valley Police. They were both charged with murder and perverting the course of justice, while the girl who'd helped lure Stevens to his death was charged with manslaughter. In the summer of 2021, following a 5-week trial, the two teens were found guilty of murder and consequently sentenced to be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure, with minimum terms of 13 and 12 years. The girl admitted her charge and was sent to a young offender institution for a period of 3 years and 2 months. Number 10. Oklahoma cannibals. In October of 2020, criminal charges were filed against a pair of Oklahoma residents accused of luring a man to their cabin in the woods for an illegal gender reassignment surgery. The LaFleur County Sheriff revealed during a subsequent press conference that 53-year-old Bob Lee Allen and 42-year-old Thomas Evans Gates had been arrested for the predatory scheme which they'd allegedly orchestrated in an effort to satisfy their cannibalistic urges. The 28-year-old victim, whose identity wasn't disclosed, had volunteered to undergo the drastic procedure after encountering Allen and Gates online while researching castrations. On the 12th of October, the man flew from Virginia to Dallas, where he was picked up by the suspects and driven to southeast Oklahoma for the surgery. Allen and Gates allegedly laid the victim down on a makeshift table in the remote cabin, at which point the procedure commenced. The patient reported being awake during the duration of the 2-hour surgery after being injected in the needed areas. He identified Allen as the one who performed the removal itself, while Gates served as his assistant. After the surgery was completed, the men allegedly admitted to being cannibals and also indicated they planned to eat the victim's removed genitals. Allen further claimed to have a freezer full of human body parts and even showed the man pictures on his phone as proof. After Allen said he'd bury the victim's body in the woods if he died on his watch, he drove the man to a hospital in McAlester to receive treatment for the excessive bleeding he was experiencing. Medical personnel were reportedly informed by the patient that the two suspects had tried to get him to participate in the cannibalism. Hospital officials got in contact with local law enforcement about the unauthorized surgery, leading to Allen and Gates' arrest on charges that included conspiracy to commit unlicensed surgery, performing unlicensed surgery, and maiming, as well as assault and battery with a dangerous weapon. Their bail was set at $295,000 each. Number 9. Rachel McCrow, Matthew Arnold, and Alan Deere. 4 Queensland police officers were dispatched to a remote Weambilla home on December the 12th of 2022 to conduct a welfare check on New South Wales school principal Nathaniel Train, who'd supposedly gone missing. When they arrived on the rural property, law enforcement announced their presence by honking their horn. The officers subsequently moved closer to the house, at which point they were met with a barrage of gunfire. A pair of young constables identified as Rachel McCrow and Matthew Arnold were immediately slain in the ambush attack, while the other two, Keely Bruff and Randall Kirk, were left fighting for their lives. A trio of assailants emerged from the home and confiscated the fallen officers' guns and radios, while continuing to fire at their fleeing colleagues. Despite having been shot in the leg, Kirk eventually managed to get back into the police car and drive away as bullets continued to shower down around him. Bruff, meanwhile, ran into dense shrubland and successfully escaped. However, in an attempt to lure her back out into the open, the killers set the brush ablaze and continued pursuing her for 2 hours until she finally made it out. Consequently, a neighbor named Alan Deere, who'd emerged from his home after seeing smoke billow from the property, was fatally shot in the back. In the end, the 3 assailants were killed during a shootout with Queensland Police's elite CERT officers. They were subsequently identified as the purportedly missing Nathaniel Train, his ex-wife Stacey, and his brother Gareth, whom Stacey had married following their divorce. It was determined that the trio had purposefully lured the police to their isolated property with Nathaniel's fictitious disappearance for the expressed purpose of ambushing the responding officers. Investigators learned that the Trains had set up a sophisticated surveillance network to aid them in their bid to murder as many police officers as possible. In the shocking incident's aftermath, more and more details emerged regarding the Trains' increasingly disturbing behavior, which had prompted students to leave the schools they taught at in droves. Number 8. Roxanne Innes. At around 7:30 p.m. on March the 8th of 2022, Texas woman Roxanne Innes heard a knock on the front door of her Baytown residence in the 3100 block of Ohio Street, near Louisiana Street. When the 55-year-old grandmother stepped outside, she was met by Demir Ricardo Ferguson, who claimed to have sideswiped her car. Unbeknownst to Innes, however, a man armed with a gun was lying in wait on her property. He eventually emerged and fatally shot the woman in the head, then fled the scene with 18-year-old Ferguson in tow. 2 days later, the police released video footage taken from the victim's Ring doorbell camera, which appeared to show a man dressed as a woman pacing on the front porch in the moments leading up to the shooting. Tipsters swiftly identified the individual in the security footage as Ferguson, who'd fled to Cincinnati, Ohio in the wake of the incident. Law enforcement tracked him down and arrested him. He admitted to purchasing the disguise and luring Innes out of her house, but denied having been involved in the shooting itself. Ferguson said he'd been given $200 by the gunman, whom he called Mr., to drive to the location and set up the ambush. Ferguson also revealed that he'd been given $15,000 to keep quiet about the crime. He was charged with murder and tampering with evidence, the latter of which stemmed from the fact that he'd disposed of floor mats with DNA on them. 2 months later, in May of 2022, a man by the name of Leland Williams was arrested and charged with the murder. In an odd twist of developments, his motives remain unclear and unknown to this very day. Number 7. Phoenix police ambush. Early on the morning of February the 11th of 2022, Arizona man Morris Richard Jones III dialed 911, claiming that his wife had been shot by an intruder who'd broken into their home near 51st Avenue and Broadway Road in Phoenix. When a responding police officer approached the man's residence a short time later, he was invited inside before being shot in an ambush attack. Although the policeman reportedly sustained multiple gunshot wounds, they weren't ultimately deemed life-threatening. Backup officers were subsequently dispatched to the scene and surrounded the home, with Jones still barricaded inside. A tense 5-hour standoff ensued, during which a man emerged from inside the house with a baby in his arms. The individual placed the infant on the ground and then approached law enforcement with his hands above his head. He was taken into custody without incident and reportedly cooperated with investigators. Jones, meanwhile, remained inside the house. As officers attempted to retrieve the baby, the gunman opened fire on them. The police returned fire, but several officers were left injured. either by direct hits from Jones or ricocheting bullets and shrapnel. When the police were finally able to gain access to the home, they found Jones dead from a His ex-girlfriend, 29-year-old Shatifa Lobley, had reportedly been gunned down by the suspect before his call to 911. In total, 9 Phoenix officers were injured in the ambush attack. Number 6. Grinder Conspiracy. Beginning in December of 2017, 4 co-conspirators from Texas targeted multiple victims for violent crimes by luring them through the online dating app Grindr. According to a Justice Department press release, the suspects specifically sought out gay men who they'd arranged to meet at an apartment complex in Dallas. Upon their arrival, however, the conspirators would hold the victims at gunpoint and drive them to ATMs around town, where they'd force them to withdraw cash from their bank accounts. One of the suspects, identified as Daniel Jenkins, later admitted to creating fake online dating profiles with the intention of robbing individuals they perceived to be gay. At least one of the reported victims was physically harmed by the group, and another was allegedly carjacked. Furthermore, Jenkins revealed to investigators that he and his accomplices had regularly used homophobic slurs during their encounters with victims, and a member of the group had even tried to abuse one of the targets. Each of the 4 suspects pleaded guilty to a slew of charges, including 1 count of conspiracy to commit hate crimes, kidnapping, and carjacking, as well as 1 count of use of a firearm during and in relation to a crime of violence. Jenkins was ultimately sentenced to 23 years in federal prison under the plea agreement. Co-conspirators Michael Atkinson, Pablo Geneseros de Leon, and Darrell Henry received prison terms of 11, 22, and 20 years, respectively. Number 5. Michael Lopez, Justin Yvicura, Jorge Tigre, and Jefferson Villalobos. A 17-year-old from Long Island, New York, was arrested for luring a group of teens into the woods on April the 11th of 2017 as part of a planned gang attack. The suspect, identified as Lenice Escobar, was an admitted member of the infamous international crime enterprise known as MS-13. She reportedly went by the nickname La Diablita, or Little Devil. On the day in question, Escobar convinced 5 young men to meet her at a park in central Islip to smoke marijuana. Upon arrival, however, the victims were ambushed by more than a dozen other MS-13 members who unleashed a brutal attack with machetes, knives, an axe, and tree limbs. Michael Lopez, Justin Yvicura, Jorge Tigre, and Jefferson Villalobos were each killed in the onslaught, while Alexander Ruiz managed to escape by fleeing on foot. While investigating the matter, the police learned that the MS-13 members who carried out the attack were under the impression that the victims belonged to a rival gang. At least 2 of the slain teens had uploaded pictures on social media in which they were holding up MS-13 gang signs, which the group perceived as an act of disrespect. In the incident's aftermath, Escobar attempted to eliminate any evidence of her involvement by throwing out a blood-stained sweatshirt and tossing her cell phone out a car window while being followed by police. More than a dozen MS-13 gang members were criminally charged in connection to the violent ambush. In April of 2022, Escobar was found guilty of racketeering, conspiracy to murder rival gang members, obstruction of justice, and murder in aid of racketeering, which carried a maximum sentence of life in prison. Number 4. Marcus Olmsted. On the night of December the 26th of 2018, Marcus Olmsted received a message on Instagram from a young woman he was talking to, who arranged for them to meet outside his home in Muskegon County, Michigan. When 20-year-old Olmsted walked out to his driveway, however, he wasn't met by the woman, but rather her boyfriend, Naoki Stephen Bull, who proceeded to shoot him with a crossbow. Although the victim's father and stepmother were inside the home at the time, they believed their son had left with the woman he was expecting, and therefore weren't aware of his critical condition. Olmsted was found by his twin brother about an hour later. When emergency medical crews arrived, he was pronounced dead at the scene. The following day, police tracked Bull down to his girlfriend's house in Grand Rapids. During the questioning, the young man reportedly admitted to firing the crossbow in the direction of Olmsted's house, but denied having shot the victim directly. Investigators learned that Bull had purchased the crossbow bolts at a Newaygo County ammunition store several hours before he lured Olmsted outside for the ambush attack. It was determined that the shooting had stemmed from the two young men's mutual romantic interest in the woman Bull was at the time still dating. In August of 2021, Bull agreed to a deal with prosecutors under which he pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. He was subsequently sentenced to spend between 20 and 70 years behind bars for the crime. Number 3. Ashley Bocanegra. In the afternoon of August the 11th of 2022, Georgia mother Ashley Bocanegra was lured to an apartment complex in Beaufort, where she was confronted by a pair of women. What ensued was a physical altercation, reportedly witnessed by a neighbor, in which 30-year-old Bocanegra was savagely beaten by Antonetta Stevens and Janine Gonzalez, who also stole her cell phone. The victim was subsequently taken to the hospital with injuries that included fractured ribs and punctured internal organs. Due to the severity of her condition, she needed to be airlifted to a second hospital, but ultimately succumbed to her injuries prior to undergoing surgery. In the immediate aftermath, Gwinnett homicide detectives went to the apartment where the incident occurred and questioned both Stevens and Gonzalez about the events that had transpired. It was determined that the women had targeted Bocanegra due to her romantic involvement with Gonzalez's brother, who was also allegedly in a relationship with Stevens at the time. The latter was jealous of the man's ties to Bocanegra, with whom he reportedly shared a son. Both suspects were arrested and charged with aggravated battery, robbery, and felony murder. The victim was described as a New York City native who'd relocated to Georgia for a better life for herself and her son. A GoFundMe campaign was launched to help pay for the costs associated with bringing Bocanegra's body back to her home state of New York. Number 2. Texas campsite killings. Texas couple Thomas Camp and Hannah Johnson took their children as well as Hannah's parents, Carl and Cynthia, on a weekend camping trip at their recently purchased property in Tennessee Colony on November the 14th of 2015. At some point, their vehicle got stuck in the mud. The car was eventually freed, however, by a man on a tractor who happened upon the family in need and sprung into action. The purported Good Samaritan was later identified as 33-year-old William Mitchell Hudson. The latter subsequently shared alcoholic beverages with the family at their campsite before the situation took a sudden dark turn. Hudson accompanied some of the family members into the woods, which was when Cynthia reported hearing multiple gunshots. The only one who emerged from the woods was Hudson, who chased Hannah and Carl into their camper trailer. In a subsequent statement to law enforcement, Cynthia claimed to have witnessed Hudson gun her husband down on the steps of the trailer after fatally shooting her daughter. Cynthia remained hidden for several hours until she felt it was safe to come out, at which point she called the police. The following morning, officers went to Hudson's residence, where they found his blood-stained tractor. A standoff ensued when the man refused to come outside, but he eventually relented and surrendered to the police. He was taken into custody on murder charges, with his bond set at a reported $2.5 million. Cynthia was taken to the hospital, where she was found to be in stable physical condition. In the aftermath, details began to emerge regarding a potential motive for the killings. Hudson's father had sold the property where the incident took place to Thomas Camp. The sale reportedly angered Hudson, who was further inflamed by Camp's decision to chain lock the property's front gate, making it private land. Hudson thus broke onto the property and murdered Camp's family in retaliation for what he perceived to be a series of personal slights. In November of 2017, the man was convicted of 3 counts of capital murder and was consequently sentenced to death by lethal injection. Number 1. Desiree Turner. When Utah teen Desiree Turner didn't return home after school on February the 16th of 2017, her parents reported her missing to the authorities, setting a massive search effort into motion. At around midnight, 2 of Turner's friends tracked her down using her cell phone's location information. She was found lying lifelessly in a dry canal in Smithfield, suffering from an apparent gunshot wound to the head. Upon being rushed to the hospital, Turner was placed in a medically induced coma. Although she did ultimately survive, she was left with partial blindness, as well as paralysis and weakness on her left side as a result of the shooting. Investigators determined that the crime had been committed by 16-year-old Coulter Peterson, along with another teenage boy named as Jason Decker. Official reports on the matter identified the two perpetrators as Turner's classmates at Green Canyon High School, while Peterson was further described as a friend of the girls. According to the Salt Lake Tribune, on the night of the incident, Peterson was complaining to Decker about how often Turner would send him messages on Snapchat. The suggestion was subsequently made that Peterson simply kill the girl to eliminate his problem altogether, at which point he and Decker devised a plot to lure Turner to the canal under the false pretense of selling her a knife. When she arrived, Decker pretended to be looking for a missing ring on the ground. Meanwhile, Peterson brandished a firearm and shot Turner in the back of the head while she was distracted. The teen boys then abandoned her to die, making off with some of her valuables, including cash and an iPod. As a result of the ensuing police investigation, both Peterson and Decker were arrested on charges of attempted aggravated murder, aggravated robbery, as well as 4 counts of obstruction of justice. During Peterson's sentencing hearing in 2018, Turner addressed her former friend directly, saying, "I hate you. I hate what you did to me. I hate that I trusted you. Your life shall be confined to a small room, and my life will also be confined." Both defendants were ultimately sentenced to prison terms of 15 years to life. Thanks for watching. Be sure to click on one of the links on your screen for more videos.